are these people?
This one, so we talked about history in our my last segment regarding Manifest Destiny. So we're gonna go not into that but in a similar sense of how can we teach these subjects in a way that kind of helps our students know of the reality of why we're here and what can we do to prevent future occurrences of those actions from happening again.
Yeah.
As we're kind of seeing now. So it will kind of make sense now. Yeah, this might be a very teacher-centric article, but I think even in this there's a lot of information here that I think even you can definitely pull out and kind of resonate with. But as you know, like we've reported, like obviously with Trump, there's a fear like the U.S. Department of Education is going to be dismantled. And as I keep saying, I don't know entirely what that means specifically, but keep in mind, and I had to say this to people online, a lot of your curriculum is decided, pretty much all your curriculum actually is decided by the state. The federal government has nothing to do with what you learn in school. The federal government's job primarily in terms of, especially with the U.S. Department of Ed, is to get like its main job is to give money to schools, especially to low-income schools to cover the costs, to essentially subsidize the costs of the students who are there. Keep in mind also, the majority of your funding in schools comes from your property taxes. So if you're in a rich, affluent area, you're generally paying high property taxes anyway, which is going to go to your schools. So generally, those schools in those areas are going to do, for the most part, fairly well. Like if you're in a low-income area where people are not necessarily own property or renting, there may not be much property tax to be had. So that's when the federal government comes in to help subsidize its costs for those schools in particular. So let's make that clarification, because I see a lot of people online being like, oh, well, thinking that the federal government has say in your curriculum. No, it's actually your state government. So this is kind of why I say you should have more beef with what's going on locally versus what's going on the federal level. So you have a problem with your curriculum, talk to your state representatives, not Trump, Biden, any of those assholes in the federal government. They usually have nothing to do with that bullshit. But that being said, we're going to talk about how to teach and probably learn, in this case, without fear. So this is a Sheer Post article written by Jim Maynard, also titled Teaching Without Fear. And he starts with, now, I have issue with John Lewis. This may not be popular among the Black community, but I think he's he is a sellout. He is, I think, just kind of typical, like, revolutionary type, but he got in within the right crowd that enriched him, and he started being shit libby. But this is one of the quotes, especially within my circles, that I hear a lot that is kind of nauseating to me, just knowing he's right, but just knowing what he became to be for the latter years of his life is just kind of sickening to me. But he starts with this quote from him that he tweeted in 2018 that a lot of people that I know in my circles use a lot, where he said, "Do not get lost in the sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." Yeah, it's funny how it's easy to say that when Republicans president, but people are not as quick to do that, or kind of more tepid to do that when it's a Democrat. But I digress. But anyway, Jim writes, more than 4 years ago, I wrote a piece entitled "Patriotic History is Fake History," in which I reported that then President Donald Trump, during his first term, had insisted that we must teach our children that they are the citizens of the most exceptional nation in the history of the world. I beg to differ, but I digress. At the same time, he signed an executive order to establish a national commission to promote patriotic education, calling it the 1776 Commission. It would be based on the 1776 report that was released by the commission to promote, quote unquote, patriotic education. Despite the fact that the 1776 report had been criticized by historians for being filled with errors and partisan politics, it was reestablished by Trump last month as part of an executive order titled Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling. Anyone teaching American history should become familiar with what is in this new executive order because it is directly aimed at what me and other teachers teach. It begins by stating that American parents trust that American schools will provide their children with a rigorous education and that they will instill a patriotic admiration for our incredible nation. Both of these claims deserve a serious response.
Which I think we also talked about that 1776 commission. I think me and Indy did. I think it was like 2 years ago. I think Indy. Correct me if I'm wrong. It was a minute ago.
Yeah. Unfortunately, what I found in 3 separate evaluations of American schooling does not come close to what deserves to be described as rigorous. If a rigorous education is one that reflects a high level of engagement where students are analyzing information in creative ways, then what we have is not very rigorous. I totally agree. If a rigorous education is one that adheres to strict standards of achievement, what we have is not rigorous. Here's the evidence. Gallup has tracked American satisfaction with the education system annually since 1999. The latest findings from August 2024 show that only 9% of Americans say they are completely satisfied with the quality of education attained by U.S. students in kindergarten through 12th grade. 34% are somewhat satisfied, 34% somewhat dissatisfied, and 21% are completely dissatisfied. Also, according to Gallup, those results are considered across most major Democratic subgroups, including Republicans and Republican-leaning independents and Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents. The results of the National Assessment of Education Progress in 2024, often called Americans Report Card, are also disappointing. The 2 most significant findings are summarized as follows. 1. U.S. students have not recovered from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. National scores continue to be below pre-pandemic levels 2019 in all grades and subjects tested. 2. Higher performing students drove most of the progress made in 2024, which I will argue, and probably correctly, is part to your socioeconomic status. The better your socioeconomic status, the better it's not going to affect you as much. If anything, you will probably more likely continue to do well versus students who are not, who are low income. The large gap between higher performing and lower performing students is growing. A third respected evaluation of American schools is a program for international student assessment, or PISA. This report reinforces some of the findings above. The most recent results show disturbing inequalities in American education. Black and Hispanic students on average score far below Asian and white students. Those from low-income backgrounds score lower than their more affluent peers. Eric A. Honchak, an economist from the conservative Hoover Institution of Stanford University, estimated that the U.S. economy would grow 4.5% in 20 years if our students' math and science skills were as strong as those of the rest of the world. The second point made by the president, that American parents trust that schools will instill patriotic admiration of our incredible nation, is not quantifiable, and it's not even included in the California Content Standards for History. As the National Education Association, NEA, states, it is not the school's responsibility to teach students what to think. Rather, it is the school's responsibility to teach students how to think critically and to develop their own viewpoints, which, while they say that, I would argue does not always happen in practice, especially if you're trying to teach to standardized testing. So holistically, I agree. But given me being in the field for 20 years, I don't really see that like done. And I'm even fighting with people now to kind of bring it to the idea of like we should be helping them how to think through things versus just regurgitating the information that our overlords want our students to know. Does this resonate with you in any way, shape, or form? I'm sure it does.
Oh yeah, for sure. Standard stuff, you know. So, like, yeah, classic rewriting of history mainly, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right, but I think it's the idea of trying to bring it back to a state which I would argue it's not to say it didn't exist. It was the idea that it was mostly created for white affluent people that almost have a baseline in terms of knowledge that you can kind of pull from. And not to say they're not all going to think in the same way. Obviously, you know, as I say, there's diversity even among the white. So especially in this country, especially regionally, you know, there are cultural differences among white people depending where you are in the country. But even within that, there could be like a clear slate of education, I would say generally for white people, that's more or less accepted, I would argue.
yeah.
Versus if you are a child of color, where our history is a little more, I would say, I don't want to say different, but like kind of opposes to that worldview. That's kind of where a lot of that clash is coming in. Because it's the idea of like, no, we want to teach our children the one standard without taking into consideration, you know, which we kind of talked about in our first segment of Manifest Destiny. We hear about the growth and the rise, you know, of American sovereignty, but we never talk about the side effects in terms of what happened to the Native Americans in
Right.
response to that, or slaves, black slaves in response to that, or if you want to go a little further into that, like how we immigrated Asian people to build the railroads here, don't hear that side of it, or the Latin American population that emigrated here, don't hear their side of it. Or you can look, you can even argue immigrants, white immigrants who came over here later, like around the turn of the century. Like we're lucky if I think we hear about them a little bit more, but even then, it's like still not necessarily fully represented in terms of their specific culture / country. It's all just kind of lumped together as white people.
Right. When we've talked about this, when in regards to like critical race theory, stuff like that too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's they really don't want you talking about the solutions to those problems. So they just don't state the problem. So it's like if they don't think there's a problem, they won't want to try and fix it. You know?
Right.
So that's part of that. And they don't even care what your solution is. They just like, nope.
No.
We like it the way it is. Thank you. You know. But anyway.
Yeah. Before looking more closely at the content of Trump's executive order, I need to make very clear who is responsible for what is taught in our schools. When the founders met in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft a new constitution, they decided on a separation of state and national powers known as federalism. According to this division of power, it is the states that generally oversee the content of K-12 education, as I said earlier. So keep that in mind. And this is, again, in relation to the U.S. Department of Ed, they have nothing to do with what's being taught in school. Your state does. So you have an issue with the education, talk to your state representatives. Anyway, in California, for example, what is taught about American history is outlined in the state content standards and in the California State Framework. I've written extensively about this process. And depending on if you're living in America, you can check to see you can go online and generally find what your education state standards are in your state or even in your town, depending on where you live. Ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schools begins by stating that in recent years, parents have witnessed schools indoctrinate their children in radical anti-American ideologies. In fact, even the title of this order suggests that in K-12 education, there has been a widespread attempt to indoctrinate students, but provides no evidence of any indoctrination whatsoever. Clear descriptions of these anti-American ideologies are not given, other than stating that innocent children are compelled to adopt identities either as victims or oppressors solely based on their skin color and other immutable characteristics. But
yeah.
I don't even want to say it because I feel like I say it so many. But hell, I say it. And no offense to our Jewish listeners in the chat. As a Black person, I definitely understand your history. Hell, I had to learn about your history in school. Like, I mean, not many schools do, but I know more commonly talking about the Holocaust has almost become standard in many schools across the country. The fact that the book Night by Elie Wiesel is required reading among many school curriculums now.
I think Florida just replaced that with Hatchet. I think I read Hatchet 3 times, you know? Like, just because that everyone wanted kids to read Hatchet. Anyway.
Right. But it's funny, even when I was in high school in the 90s, like, everyone had to read Night in high school. And I read it even in middle school, like, on my own. So I was familiar with the book. But reading about, like, let's say, the autobiography of Malcolm X, for example, that was an elective. That I had to take with one of my teachers who was one of my English teachers at the time who happened to be Black. Shout out to Mr. Whitaker. You know, to talk about Malcolm X, you know, you had to and then that was an elective. So you had to have, for a certain class, you had to have approval to get in that class in order for you to read the book, like, in class. So something like Night, every student in the class, regardless of your race, had to read it. But Malcolm X, only a smaller number of students read it, you know, and discussed it. So certain people of certain types of victimhood, it's more acceptable than other people's, you know, isn't. So I'm being very nice here, but, you know, and again, there's nothing wrong with talking about the victimhood or the oppressor. Like, I don't see there's anything wrong with that, and I don't think really that's the point in talking about this. The idea of learning through history is what have people done in the past and in the present that were able to affect change for the future. So you have to know the reality of how we got to where we are and how that affects other people and how to figure out ways to move forward. Because ultimately, our students are going to be the ones who are leading you and I. And I would want them to be more aware of the reality of the imperialism, capitalism that we all suffer under, and being able to have the means to be able to combat against that, especially if they're privileged, because they're going to go into the world, you know, with that privilege, not to having a worry on their back. Meanwhile, there are going to be other people who, many of them might have what maybe as students, especially in my school, who may not have that same privilege. And my thing is, if you consider that person a friend, you will do your best to uplift that friend, regardless of their economic, social status, or whatever. So in my mind, it's in their best interest to learn about this And again, it's not a shot at them. It's like, oh, your ancestors did this and whatever. It's no, this is reality of once upon a time. Certain people did this. It affected these people. It affected people in other ways. But if we're looking to have this country be the country of equality and freedom as we tout all the time, what would that look like collectively? Because even in that context of freedom, that wasn't applicable to me. Like, Black Americans, or anyone else who is not white and male. So how can we get closer to that ideal, but that is more inclusive of people who are here regardless of socioeconomic status and all that kind of stuff, whatever. These are the conversations that we should be having. And these are the thinking that the discourse that we should be having in our schools.
Yeah.
But they don't want to promote that kind of
thinking. We could do super white history too. Like there's a period around France, the revolution of France, that's very important, where a very important bit of machinery was implemented to help,
Right.
GUILLOTINE.
Oh yeah, that thing.
Right.
But I digress. Anyway.
Okay, so clear descriptions of these anti-American ideologies are not given other than stating that innocent children are compelled to adopt identities either as victims or oppressors solely based on their skin color and other immutable characteristics. In 35 years of teaching American history, I can say without exception that I've never witnessed any such indoctrination, and I have never suggested to any student that he or she should adopt the identity of either victim or oppressor. If anything, they will come to that on their own, but how you work on that is what we need to teach them or help facilitate those discussions, if anything else. So what is the point of this new executive order? I believe that President Trump's vague reference to anti-American ideologies is meant to intimidate teachers into avoiding any discussion of anything that might be interpreted as negative, including unavoidable topics like race-based slavery, even though that was eliminated with this country with a civil war. Not really, but we get the point. Nevertheless, according to the NEA, in the last few years, 20 states have passed laws or issued statewide rules that aim to restrict the ways educators can teach uncomfortable subjects like the history or racism or sexism in the US. Having written a great deal on the content of American history textbooks, I'm convinced that schools cannot afford to dilute the already sanitized history found in those books. If we want to teach students to think critically, teachers must take the advice of civil rights activist John Lewis and not get lost in the sea of despair. Teachers must avoid being afraid to teach a history that includes an examination of legalized discrimination, racism, slavery, and sexism, especially because in doing so, they would deny students an appreciation of the historic struggles, often successful, against discrimination and oppression that are also parts of American history. Ironically, avoiding such victories, often over institutional discrimination, would seem to work against what Mr. Trump demands to be taught as inspiring and ennobling characteristics of American history. In a section of Trump's executive order meant to define terms, it is suggested that it's wrong to treat members of one race, color, sex, or national origin as morally or inherently superior to members of another race, color, sex, or national origin. I completely agree with this principle, and as a teacher, I attempted to teach in accordance with such agreement. But that did not prevent me, nor should it prevent any teacher, from suggesting that some individuals and groups may still suffer from the consequences of previous discrimination. Perhaps using the past to explain the present is what some consider an ideology. But it's also the definition of education. Education, in fact, demands that we consider the likely consequences of past circumstances to help explain current conditions.
Mm-hmm.
This is exactly the message that Jared Diamond delivered in his fascinating book, Gums, Germs, and Steel,
in
which he explained while some civilizations have historically done very well due to geographical advantages, particularly the availability of domesticable plants and animals. In a similar sense, one might observe that some American indigenous peoples, whose ancestors survived repeated attacks and suffered the loss of both land and culture, now suffer extreme poverty and high rates of malnutrition. The U.S. may not be fundamentally discriminatory, but in order to educate, teachers must discuss the history of discrimination. It would be contradictory to suggest that one of the two examples mentioned above is part of an anti-American ideology, while the other is simply education. Is it not enough to agree that members of one race or gender are never inherently superior to members of another race or gender? In President Trump's executive order, patriotic education is defined as the preservation of American history grounded in the following: an accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling characterization of America's founding and founding principles. The order also suggests that a patriotic education must show how the U.S. as a nation has grown closer to its noble principles. What are they? How do I know? That could be defined. Both of these statements are open to interpretation regarding how one might demonstrate this patriotism and both invite a wide range of accurate and inspiring examples from our shared history. What follows are examples of what I believe work well. Patriotic education should feature the life and struggles of Frederick Douglass, who unforgettably admitted to a criminal past in stealing himself from his property owner. And shout out to DC, who actually he's one of a huge contingent in our upper elementary grades. They learn a lot about Frederick Douglass in DC, especially since he used to live in the area. So
right.
Shout out to DC, at least in our curriculum, for featuring him quite a bit. Patriotic education should also include an accurate and inspiring discussion of the triumphs of Susan B. Anthony, including the statement she made at the end of her trial for voting illegally in 1872. It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, not we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed this union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our prosperity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this Democratic Republican government. About, look, she talked all great here, but what she was saying here did not apply to Black women. So that also should be something to be
American
discussed.
bullshit.
Right. She
Your
only
vote
meant
counts.
that for,
the press is free.
Oh, that was it.
American bullshit.
She meant that for white women like her. So that, should be also discussed. Not to say it wasn't a good example, but even with that, there's nuance to that too. Is it not inspirational that even after the 19th Amendment was ratified and the right of women to vote had been recognized, Alice Paul wrote the Equal Rights Amendment and spent most of her life fighting for its ratification? It was, as John Lewis said, the struggle of her lifetime. Of course, patriotic education should emphasize the actions of President Harry Truman in support of equality. In 1948, he signed the Women's Armed Service Integration Act, allowing women to receive regular permanent status in the armed forces. And in July of the same year, his Executive Order 9981 mandated military desegregation. Is it not inspirational that a former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, led the effort at the United Nations for ratification of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948? Funny how we say that, but look what's happening in Gaza now.
Yep.
Again, nuance. How can students not be inspired by Fred Korematsu, a civil rights leader who fought against the wrongful internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II? How can students not be motivated by the Supreme Court's majority decision in Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969, which held that neither students nor teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate? We can all be proud of Title IX in the Education Amendments of 1972, which prohibits sex discrimination in any educational program or activity that receives federal financial aid, and by requiring schools to provide equal opportunities for girls and boys to participate in sports. No matter where we get our education, it is clear that American history is filled with inspirational people, many of whom are insisted of making good trouble necessary trouble. I mentioned earlier that according to the EA, in the last few years, 20 states have passed laws or issued statewide rules that aim to restrict the ways educators can teach uncomfortable subjects, such as the history of racism and sexism in the United States. If anyone wonders, California, where I live, is not one of those states. But if you work in a state with such rules, the NEA provides state-specific Know Your Rights guides. These guides are meant to help teachers understand what the laws in each state prohibit, as well as what they do not. The local and state affiliates of the NEA make it possible for every educator in every city and every state to join with others to create great public schools. The National Council for Social Justice Studies believes that the January 29th executive order ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling does not address the core challenges of teaching and learning social studies in today's K-12 classrooms. The NCSS remains dedicated to supporting social studies educators and has issued position statements on a variety of related issues. In its February response to President Trump's executive order, the NESS stated, NCSS has consistently supported the idea that states and local education entities are best positioned to develop social studies standards. As one of the first education organizations to establish a code of professional ethics, we have long defended the academic freedom of both students and teachers. The teaching of U.S. history should invite discussion, encourage inquiry, and reflect the diverse people, places, and events that shape our shared human experience. A strong social studies education helps students develop the ability to analyze information, engage in meaningful discourse, and contribute thoughtfully to their communities. By prioritizing social studies education and accurately training the rules of our educators, we can help future generations develop the skills needed for the lifelong civic engagement, informing decision-making, and meaningful participation in our democracy. In the end, we are all in this together, as Doug Lewis reminds us in his 2017 memoir. You are a light, never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Study the path of others to make your way easier and more abundant. So, I mean, there's a lot of good thoughts there, but as I said, not necessarily done in practice. But yeah, I think for me, look, I'll say this for myself, living in DC, I feel safe generally. Like, I'm not in a place, fortunately, where I feel like my rights as an educator, what I teach is, it's at critical mass. But other states are not far from me. But again, it's a question of, I think really this is what it comes down to, is the idea of, funny how they talk about we don't want to indoctrinate our kids, but when what I think, a conservative's ideal is that it's essentially indoctrinating our kids in certain ways that lead to this groupthink in terms of what this country, or the illusion of what this country is. It's still kind of, if you want to go back to the Manifest Destiny, is the idea of this America is this great, wonderful, powerful, noble country. And I think the idea that a lot of people now are kind of calling the country out, especially if we could look at history and examples of like, no, America, not to say America has not done some good things, but, and you can say that of every country, like, it's done some good things, but it's done a lot of shit. Both need to be discussed, both need to be analyzed, because if we don't want our students to prolong or repeat a lot of the things that have done in the past, they have to know what has been done and being able to kind of figure out, they did this shit wrong. Let's try and do it another way, or a way that kind of helps elevate and sustain the human experience, especially now that we are a little more interconnected globally and we're able to see more readily how the actions of this country have influence over other countries, which I also believe is part of the reason why they kind of want, this is kind of a form of American isolationism in the classroom. To not make those connections, so that, God forbid, if we ever go to war, then it's still the idea of like, these countries are wrong, they suck, and blah, 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 and not kind of put the finger on us in terms of how are we expediting a lot of the imperialism and colonialism that we've seen in the past and that we continue to promote currently. And again, this is not a Trump issue. I would argue it's an American. And I think other countries can see that very readily in terms of what the US is kind of symbolic as. So I feel that it's just kind of a way to kind of isolate ourselves more from the rest of the world. But it's funny, even in this, they're kind of saying, no, we want to have our students be more aware of the world by talking about how America is good, which is revisionist history that I'm not a fan of.
We are the United States government. We don't do that sort of thing.
I don't. So, so like I said, I'm not in a position where I need to worry. And God forbid if I was, but this is part of the reason why teachers leave the profession. Because, especially if you're a teacher of color, because you almost have to lie to yourself and lie to your students about the reality of your experience and how it can shape their minds into possibly thinking differently or kind of counter what they might believe. But teaching in a way that that does promote the establishment, to keep you essentially a robot in terms of our experience. God forbid that you actually have some radical movement makers that can essentially become the future Black Panther Party, for example. So like, God forbid we have something like that. But your thoughts, because I know you coming from the South, you have a different experience than me.
Well, and my mother being a teacher for, most of her life, and a general educator, it's definitely tough. You're constantly hit with state standards. You're constantly hit with like testing standards. On top of that, you're paid nothing, and like now they're wanting you to avoid entire topics. Your history books are normally, decades behind anyway, so like you're underfunded. I mean, it's definitely not a easy thing, but it's, this is the stuff you got to keep track of. All those little rules trickle down, so, and coming from a state here in Florida where we're inventing a lot of these education, anti-free speech laws, so, and with Marco Rubio now being in the position he's in, shit's gonna get weird, but we'll see. We'll keep an eye on things.
I think at the end of the day, I think for teachers, and not just teachers, I think this is a message for all of us just what is your red line? And we kind of saw that with Gaza. Like there were a lot of people who, at least initially, were like, yeah, what's happening? When it came to vote, it was like, oh, well, we have to vote for the lesser of the two evils because, yeah, Biden is shit on genocide, but Trump is going to be way worse on the genocide. So it's like, well, how does you voting for either one of them what they have current experience? And at this point, you can probably, just given our show and what we've talked about, and I know what you and India have talked about regarding Israel over the past year and change, probably now closer to 2, like we know the history now probably a lot more intimate way than most of the population at this point, that we're kind of firm in our stance, in terms of on our stance on Gaza, but we're able to make the connections in terms of, the imperialism that we're seeing in the Middle East and how essentially Israel is the newest military base of the United States. So, one of, I would argue. So, and we need students to make those connections so that they're better able to understand. And again, it's not an idea of victimhood versus an oppressor. Like, if students come to that on their own, whatever, but my job is to help facilitate. And again, it's not the idea of you living out your life as a victim or living your life as an oppressor. The idea should be you in this current age with, I'll say, the relative richness that you get in terms of living in this country. What can you do moving forward, or what can you help to do moving forward that moves us in a better way, where we're not using these antiquated systems of control and exploitation in a way that affirms everyone truly, regardless of their race, sex, gender, like all the things that we kind of talk about, but make it really authentic in this. Those are discussions that we should be having, regardless of where you are. And it's sad that we don't, but ideally, that's what we should be discussing in schools right now, everywhere, is, our students within the next 10 to 20 years are going, if we're not in the World War III stance, but even without that, there's a lot of issues that our students have to solve. We have a climate change crisis. We have a food crisis. We have an economic, like every crisis that you can think of under the sun. And it's only going to get worse, I was sure, within the next few decades. So unless we have students who are able to think through those things practically and not just kind of rehash what has been done, then we're in trouble.
Yeah.
And honestly, I feel like in a lot of ways, I'm a part of the establishment in that regard, because there's only so much that I can teach them beyond what I want to teach them. But if I know, and I'm glad that I'm at a school where they don't really care what I do. So not to say they don't care, but it's like I have all the control that I have. I have pretty much autonomy in what I teach them, my student, at least in my grade. So I ultimately, well, by way of my students, I have a lot of say, but I know other schools do not have that privilege. So you're more restricted. And a lot of it, in part, that's why a lot of teachers leave. In part because they feel like they're selling out to the establishment versus actually teaching their authenticness of what education should be. As the article said, we're not trying to the idea should be not to teach them how to think, but how to think through things and to think creatively in the ways that they're wired to solve problems. So,
is there a more important job than that of a teacher?
Probably not, but in this country, we don't get respect. But ain't get no respect. No respect at all. All right.
But that's why talking about stories like these, we are demonetized. Although I'm not sure why for this story. But regardless, if you want to support us and help us potentially be boosting the algorithm, you could, especially if you want to help us financially, you can scan the QR code that you see on your screen, or you can go to the Ko-fi link that you see at the bottom of your screen there. If you're in the YouTube chat, please, you can type in ! donate, all one word, and the link will pop up in the chat, and you can click on the link. And any little bit helps, even as little as $1 to help turn on the lights on here. We obviously know that for many of you, finances are kind of tight. So the free way to support us is through word of mouth. Definitely share our content, like our content, and make sure you're subscribed to our content so you'll be notified of, well, allegedly, when we put out new clips, or notified when we do live streams. And help us get to 3K. We've been very lucky. Well, very lucky and very blessed that we have people subscribing, even despite the blackout that we experienced on YouTube. But we're very grateful to all of you who are able to support us, whether sharing our content or financially or both. And thanks for watching.